Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Sufficiency and Wellbeing Experience. I'm Lily Edelman Gold, and I have our co editor from the Sufficiency and Wellbeing magazine today, Vlad. And we are going to be talking about The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity by David Graeber and David Wengrow. Both of us, Vlad's read the whole book. I've only read half, but we thought it was a really pertinent topic, and they have some really nuggets of wisdom that we think are really great to talk about that relate to degrowth.
And for our viewers, behind me, there's Fifi, if you can see it. It's our
Special guest.
Bouchon, a special guest.
Do you want to talk a little bit about your takeaways from the book as a whole?
Well, in a nutshell, the book is not necessarily a history of inequality or equality itself, how equality emerged. It's an expose of various stories from history that showed how civilization, how humans have organized themselves in many different ways. So the main thesis of the book is, I suppose, that there is no such thing as a human nature by itself that's immutable, that doesn't change, and that humans have experimented with various kinds of social organizations, from the most egalitarian societies to the most hierarchical throughout history, throughout millennia. And what we have today, fast forward in our society, it's largely defined by capitalism, is only one form of the many ways in which we can organize ourselves.
Yeah, and especially that kind of this story of that we tell ourselves that agriculture led to enclosure, led to capitalism is kind of wholly false. And that people were practicing agriculture for thousands of years before what we think of as the agricultural revolution. And many societies actually rejected agriculture and chose to do kind of a foraging, nomadic lifestyle, but whether it was seasonally or just wholly altogether. So he kind of exposes that story that we've liked to use as the history of humankind as being kind of a myth, which I think is really interesting and also lends more credence to the kind of thinking about alternate ways of how we can
Yeah.
organize our societies that are not just capitalism based. So
Right.
anyway, do you want to start with your quote?
Yes. So this is, I think, my favorite quote from the entire book is when a French aristocrat by the name of Louis Armand de l'Homme d'Ars, Baron de La Hontan, meets with a Native American statesman. He's a Huron-Wendat by the name of Candiarong. And they have an exchange which is captured in La Hontan's writings. Just to set the scene, Candiarong is willing to propose that Europe would be better off if its whole social system was dismantled. So here's what La Hontan says, the Baron. Try for once in your life to actually listen. Can't you see, my dear friend, that the nations of Europe could not survive without gold and silver, or some similar precious symbol? Without it, nobles, priests, merchants, and any other number of others who lack the strength to work the soil would simply die of hunger. Our kings would not be kings. What soldiers would we have? Who would work for kings or anybody else? It would plunge Europe into chaos and create the most dismal confusion imaginable. And the response from Kandiarong, you honestly think you are going to sway me by appealing to the needs of nobles, merchants, and priests? If you abandoned conceptions of mine and thine, that's you, yes, such distinctions between men would dissolve. A leveling equality would then take its place among you, as it now does among the Wendat, his peoples. And yes, for the first 30 years after the banishing of self-interest, no doubt you would indeed see a certain desolation, as those who are only qualified to eat, drink, sleep, and take pleasure would languish and die. But their progeny would be fit for our way of living. Over and over, I have set forth the qualities that we, Wendat, believe ought to define humanity: wisdom, reason, equity, etc., and demonstrated that the existence of separate material interests knocks out all these on the head. A man motivated by interest cannot be a man of reason.
Mm,
And that is the quote. What do
yeah.
you think about this?
I feel like there's so much resonance there with how our global society is playing out right now. I mean, particularly the importance of private property. And there's another quote that I want to bring up in a bit that I think is really interesting about private property. But kind of he's saying like the people who let the wealthy perish, first of all, which yes, absolutely. But particularly because they're the ones without who are lacking the real skills that are necessary. And I think that has a lot of resonance for the way we've constructed society today, the kind of value we've put on soft skills and intellectualization and all that kind of stuff. Like a lot of us are lacking real skills that are going to help us through a crisis, right? Like none of us know how to sew. None of us know
Mhm.
how to fix a broken leg. Like there are a lot of skills that we've lost. Kanyaranka is basically saying like let those people die off because they're not actually helpful to the survival of humanity. And I think that's a really great point. I think we need to bring it back to relearning the skills that are actually necessary and the ones that have value to the progress of humankind.
And for the audience, we are recording this on the day when we have the first trillionaire on this planet. Today is June the 12th. Elon Musk has listed SpaceX on the stock market. And through the market valuation, he ended up owning enough shares that are worth over $1 trillion. Needless to say, this is way more than the robber barons had in the first Gilded Age, late 1800s or early 1900s. So we're safe to say we live in the second Gilded Age. And all this, I tie easily to the design of capitalism. We can trace back through the stories in The Dawn of Everything and through what Kondarang has in his exchange with the European settlers. It goes back all the way how property is designed, as you said, and it's how it is coded into law. It hasn't changed much. The core principles of capitalism. 400 years later, we are dealing with these problems, the climate crisis and everything else. We are in a much more difficult situation than 400 years ago because we are talking about the extinction of life today.
Yeah.
um,
I do want to bring up this quote, but just to bring it back to the
yeah.
first trillionaire for a second, and just to remind everyone, because our brains literally cannot hold and understand what that means. I don't remember what the like limit is for our brains to like be able to understand what a number means, but it's definitely way lower than a trillion. You did the math,
Mhm.
and a trillion seconds is 31,709 years. 1
Yep.
trillion seconds is over 30,000 years. That's how much money Elon Musk has. Like, that's ridiculous. He literally could not spend all of that even if he wanted to.
Yeah. Do
Um,
you want to read the rest of it, the rest of the analogy? 'Cause I think it's funny.
I think, yeah, why don't you do it? Because I'm not sure I understood it fully, and I want to hear you explain it.
I did quickly today like a mathy analogy of how much $1 trillion is. If you take the median household wealth of a Canadian, so median means half of the population has less and half have more than that, right? So that median is roughly $520,000 net wealth, so net of debts. Make that the equivalent of a one hockey puck, one puck, or make it one maple leaf, right? $1 trillion would be the equivalent of 1.92 million hockey pucks. And if those are laid side by side, one next to each other, they would cover over 7 full hockey rinks. So that's $1 trillion. And if you take the analogy of a maple leaf, so one maple leaf equals the median wealth of a Canadian household, $1 trillion would be 10 large mature maple trees at their peak in the summer. And one tree has an average of about 200,000 leaves per tree. To recap, one puck is one family compared to 7 hockey rinks. One puck is one maple leaf compared to 10 trees full of leaves. So that's the analogy and the size of comparison for $1 trillion.
Even that is hard to hold in my mind.
Yeah, I know you will have to see it. Like if you have
Yeah,
to visualize the size of 7 hockey rinks next to each other to imagine $1 trillion, and you can hold one hockey puck in your hand.
yeah,
That's how big it is.
that's crazy. Okay, but to go back to the book, there is a
Yes.
quote about the kind of conception of property, and Graeber and Wengrow kind of argue that private property being like the personal ownership of items has kind of existed for as long as humanity has existed, because we've had
Mhm.
sacred things for as long as humans have been around. But the conception of property in the Roman law understanding of the word is much newer. And so I'm going to read from this paragraph here. What makes the
Mhm.
Roman law conception of property, the basis of almost all legal systems today, unique is that the responsibility to care and share is reduced to a minimum or even eliminated entirely. In Roman law, there are three basic rights relating to possession: usus, the right to use; fructus, the right to enjoy the products of a property, for instance, the fruit of a tree; and abusus, the right to damage or destroy. If a person has only the first two rights, this is referred to as usufruct and is not considered true possession under the law. Therefore, the defining feature of true legal property is that one has the option of not taking care of it or even destroying it at will. Just to think about that and kind of summarize that for a moment, essentially, you own an item when you no longer have to take care of it. Basically, that we've
Mhm.
reduced the idea of private property down to the destruction of that property. And I think that's kind of a symbol of how destructive we've become as humans. What do you think, Vlad?
That's right. So I was thinking about my own research, which is about the causal structure of capitalism, in which I see the definition of property, what you just mentioned, as one of the core components in what drives capitalist behavior. So, property being one of the elements of capitalism, those who seek the accumulation of property are doing it for the purpose of preserving their ability of using the property for the purpose of capital accumulation. So, under capitalism, not all property is capital. But when you take property and put it to a productive use with the purpose of producing something for money, then it becomes capital.
Mm.
So capitalism cannot exist with the property rights, as you mentioned them, that go back all the way to Roman law. It cannot exist without that. So when you see corporations trying to buy land or chasing natural resources or cheap labor across the world, they are seeking to buy up property rights because that gives them the power to use them for the purpose of capital accumulation. And what's very specific about property rights is that they are defended by the state. Property is not a thing, it's a like a legal right over something. And the states are meant to defend that right. So that's why everyone is seeking capitalists, I mean, in creating property as much as possible so they can use the power of the state to defend them. Capitalism cannot be changed or reformed if this conception of property itself is not reformed itself. There are certain things that should not be made property, or there are certain things that should not be transformed into capital. Like, for example, personal data. That's the one of the most recent developments in property rights, which are being used by big tech platforms to be transformed into capital. And that form of capital is the advertising that you see on big tech platforms, which is sold on the market to advertisers. And it is essentially our personal data. That's the product that is being sold. And it's not our property. It is the property of big tech platforms. So same principles from Roman law apply today on Facebook, X, or Amazon, whatever. We operate under the same rules.
Yeah. And I think what's particularly interesting about this argument is that they're essentially saying the ownership of property, whether it's real property or whatnot, like if it's land or if it's an item or whatever, that's not necessarily a bad or harmful practice, but it's the way we think about it in that we have a right to destroy it that kind
Mhm.
of creates the conditions for the harm. And what comes to mind for me is like when companies will own a bunch of property and purposefully keep some properties vacant or like under under constructed because they can use it to write off as debt to balance out their
Mhm.
checkbooks, right? Or when companies purposefully don't use a property in the most useful way for the community because it makes more sense for their bottom line or their financials. And so that to me kind of is an emblem of the right to destroy a property being kind of the underlying foundation of property ownership.
Exactly. And if you put it in practice, we can imagine scenarios of a different kind of society and economic system in which there are limitations to what you can do to your property, but there are also limitations to how much property you can have. For example, let's take housing or real estate, which is the most common type of property that we can think of. Should we allow people to accumulate an unlimited number of housing units or real estate under their own personal names or using corporations? And this is a legitimate question because right now there's no limit to how much real estate you can own, because if you have the capital to acquire it, nobody can stop you from doing that. And you inherit all those property rights that you mentioned. You can destroy it, you cannot use it, do whatever you want with it. If we had, let's say, housing as a human right instead of a property right, right? Everyone is entitled to having a place to live. We can then design a policy to limit the amount of housing the super rich can have by virtue of law and rights. And then you can add more examples to this, like how much shares can one have in a corporations? Is this a legitimate question in the first place to have an unlimited connection between property and power? You know?
Okay, but I have a question for you.
Yes.
In the housing example,
Yeah.
let's and this is, unlikely, but let's say there's a benevolent landlord who owns a ridiculous amount of property, but
Mhm.
sees housing as a human right and so keeps rents low and fills all of their houses with tenants and treats them fairly and whatnot, whatnot, whatnot. In my mind, so that's one way of kind of attacking that problem is to reduce the amount of land that the landlord can hold. Another way of attacking that problem is to reduce the landlord's right to evict or to destroy that housing. So maybe it
Mhm.
doesn't matter so much that one person owns all of this, but the what they can do with it is regulated. And I think those are slightly different perspectives of getting at the problem.
Yes, you're right. And I think that's a super valid approach. So you also talk in terms of adjusting those property rights, limiting what you can do with it. So it's actually changing the property rights itself. It's putting limits on what you can do. There are already limits, like eminent domain is one example. You can be expropriated by the state for the purpose of a public benefit. We already have limits. So this is a way to start. Yes, by limiting those rights.
Yeah. I'm just thinking about kind of like from this perspective from the book of saying like understanding property as the having the right to destroy or not take care of something. If we change our understanding of what property is and what you can do with it, and so we eliminate the ability to destroy property as part of what is inherently like a right over ownership, then I think that also changes how we think about property and how property is used, and could potentially change kind of the structure of how capital is treated and the structure of the system as a whole.
Yes, yes, right. So I tend to see it like more holistically. For example, in my thinking of understanding capitalism, I link property to power. Capitalism allows a proportional connection between property and power, right? So in your example with the landlords, it would limit their power, right? which is traditionally proportional to the size of their property, would limit their power. If you take it a step further and if you involve the tenants into the governance of their building, if you let them decide about renovations, about the amount of the rent, how and when it's collected, how you can leave the building or how you can get new tenants, then it will further democratize the power of the landlord and it will essentially change the property itself, how you report to it. There's also the aspect of how you control the fructus part that you mentioned from Roman law, like the benefits from property. Like if your property offers revenue, like land, who decides what happens to the revenue?
Mhm.
So if you democratize that part, then you would essentially change the nature of property itself.
Yeah.
So there's many ways in which you can organize property and completely change the face of our society. So I have another quote from the book. It's something that a Jesuit priest was saying when he encountered the First Nations in North America. So here's the full quote. After a disturbance caused by a shipload of illegal liquor finding its way into the community, the governor persuaded Wendat leaders to agree to a prohibition of alcoholic beverages and published an edict to that effect. Crucially, the governor notes, backed by the threat of punishment, Father Lalemant, this is the Jesuit priest. So this is happening in the early 1600s. He records the story. From the beginning of the world to the coming of the French, the savages have never known what it was so solemnly to forbid anything to their people under any penalty, however slight. They are free people, each of whom considers himself of as much consequence as the others, and they submit to their chiefs only insofar as it pleases them. Equality here is a direct extension of freedom. Its expression, it also has almost nothing in common with the more familiar Eurasian notion of equality before the law, which is ultimately equality before the sovereign. That is once again equality in common subjugation. So that's a full quote. I brought it up just to highlight the fact that even hierarchies, the notion of social hierarchies, are a creation of recent history. And there are examples from First Nations from before they met the European settlers and colonizers that they had organized themselves in very loose or almost inexisting hierarchies. So they were not doing what the chieftain was telling them unless it made sense, for the benefit of the community. And when the Europeans met them, they were shocked that they did not have a king who told them what to do. Fast forward to today, this is exactly what we have in the organization of our society, mostly in corporations. We have kings at the top of corporations who tell their underlings what to do. It's all like a hierarchy. You cannot challenge your king or your manager. You cannot vote them out or vote them in. You essentially have to obey what they say. And sure, there are some limitations. We are not slaves anymore, but we operate with very top-down hierarchies today. And examples from history tell us that we don't have to operate that way. We can do it in a different way.
Yeah, I think their connection between the conception of freedom and hierarchies and equality is really profound. Particularly because when they frame the way they frame it, it becomes very clear that none of us are free at all to do whatever we want. And I think part of that too comes from our collective assumption that people are going to do wrong. They're going to do harm if they are free to do whatever they want. We assume that humans are bad actors. Whereas the indigenous communities that they're talking about had created a society where the responsibility for any harm done was then on the community to kind of assume and make up for. Like if someone kills someone, their entire family has to, the killer's entire family then has to do something in response or kind of reciprocation. But the entire community is responsible for each individual adult, which lowers the incentive for any individual to do something wrong. Whereas we don't really have incentives to not do anything wrong because we don't have like we're technically it's free, right? Like we're free people. We can do whatever we want. We're not we're not connected to anyone. We're not responsible for anyone. And I think that's
Mhm.
actually where the kind of like the shift in mindset has to be, particularly for when we talk about kind of true freedom and equality is we have to see that we're all connected.
Lily, how would you see a society being organized that is the most inclusive for all its members?
I mean, to me, the communities that Graeber and Wengrow illustrate from Native American perspective of individuals who have full autonomy over themselves, but autonomy also doesn't mean no responsibility. So they have autonomy, but they also have responsibility to each other, which creates a system of connection and reliance on each other and a community where individuals see themselves as part of a greater whole. But that also means because everyone is free to do whatever they want, there is no hierarchy. Like a system
Mhm.
can't exist with hierarchy. So I think something along that lines would be much better than what we've got going on today. Obviously, not all Native American societies were the same. Graeber and Wengrow talk about how some communities had slaves, some didn't. Some had hierarchies, some had de facto kings. Definitely, there were a lot of different variations going on pre European expansion and colonialism. I think that idea of kind of creating a community with responsibility for one another, but the freedom, true freedom to do what you think is best for yourself, which also means doing what's best for your community. And I think that's what's really important is making the connection between the individual and the community. Because when you see your individual self as not connected to anything else, then you do have incentive to do harm.
Myself, I see freedom as entirely a social construct. Perhaps we can talk in the next episode about the nature of freedom. Do we actually have it? What it means? How can we make a society if we don't have any freedom whatsoever? And how we can see freedom in a different way? Do you want to wrap up?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, that sounds great. If you want to continue listening to our conversation about freedom and personal responsibility, then definitely make sure you become a paid subscriber so you can access our next episode. But for now, thank you for listening and watching. And this has been the Sufficiency and Wellbeing Experience. We're glad to have you and see you next time.